Welcome back to Dad Space. How are you? I hope you're doing good today. I hope this podcast finds you well. This is Dad Space, a podcast for dads by dads. And today we have Mike Hynes with us. Mike is going to be talking to us about mental health. He's going to be talking to us about his dad story and going to be talking a little bit about PTSD and that journey as well. So great time together with Mike from Toronto, Canada. And hope you enjoy our conversation with Mike. And that's my dog, Duke. So welcome, Duke, to the podcast. Yeah, nice to have you. Here we go on Dad Space. So we're going to start here with Mike. Just a reminder to everybody right off the bat that we do have a Dad Space Facebook group. You are invited to join us. Meet with our past guests, meet with other dads, and do life together. Links in the show notes. Here we go with Mike. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. I'm clicking buttons and doing things. Here we go. We're all set to go. Mike is here with me. Mike and I have something in common, although we might not have ever worked together in the past. We have a retail background, grocery stores and such. But Mike is here to share his book with us. He's here to share his life story with us. We got lots of stuff to talk about. Mike Hynes is with me today. Mike, welcome to the podcast. We finally did this. We're here together.
It's fantastic to see you again. I mean, we had the pre-interview and that was smooth. And then we had some little scheduling hiccups. It's always the tech in this world, I tell you, you know?
I always blame it on the tech. It's never us, Mike. It's never us. No. Right? Because the tech never comes back with a response. So we can always blame the tech, and I love that. So thank you for being available today. Great to connect again. Let's let people know, we've already had a conversation, but let's bring everybody else into our conversation, where you are in the world and a little bit about you before we get running here.
Yeah, so I'm, Toronto, Canada, and right in the middle, Bathurst, St. Clair. I'm sure you know about it.
Oh, yeah.
I've talked about this before. I grew up in Mississauga, and these days I'm an executive coach, primarily working with people in the creative fields. But as it turns out, people who are creative and working in other fields come and see me quite a bit too. And I've got a background in psychotherapy, over 20 years there. My book is called The Myth-Guided Mind: Unleash Your God-Given Genius at Work and at Home.
And you have it right there.
I love it here just in case there's anyone on YouTube here.
Oh, yeah. I love when authors do that, by the way. That's great. Yeah. Do that many more times as we're talking, okay? Product placement.
Up here beside my ear and shoulder. And
I love it. Yeah. No, please do that as often as you wish. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go. Let's continue with that. That's great.
Yeah. So, got a 7-year-old daughter. She was 6, and she's featured in the kind of the opening of the book. And the way this book goes is about storytelling. Sure, I'm tackling difficult things like mental health and trauma and overcoming trauma. And for me, I've got the benefit of being, hate to admit this, but it's like 30 something years later since my big trauma. So one of the things that I can talk to people about is, hey, it gets way better. In fact, I can tell you from the other side, life can be absolutely amazing again, no matter how dark it might seem at this place in time. And so people do want to benefit off of that experience and say, like, is there a shortcut? Yeah. And I say, well, yeah, I mean, it's not a secret, but from the beginning of time, as social creatures, we talk to somebody. That's the shortcut.
Yeah.
Men were doing this. They got injured out in the hunt, things like that. They'd come around the fire and share the story. So in some sense, I haven't invented anything. I thought I had brilliant ideas. Everyone I looked up later is like, oh, somebody else got books about it or webinars. But it does boil down to really simple things. Human connection, talking, and in my case, I bring in the element of touch.
Great. So Mike, like the power of our story, right?
Yeah.
Our story is our story to tell. It's our story to live. And no one else can tell our story the way we can. And Absolutely. Being able to do that and find an audience or community that we could help with our story, that's huge, because a story that's kept to ourselves doesn't help anyone, really.
Yeah.
Right. And go back to your analogy, your story about gathering around the fire and telling a story about your accident or what happened, maybe that would help someone else. And they're hunting and gathering to not fall in that same trap or be hurt in the same way. So we can, by sharing that story, we can raise everyone else up around us. And that's the power of that. And that's kind of what you're focused on.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. And I take it even one step further because, I touch on myths and, fairy tales, any of these kind of stories that are passed down, whatever we happen to call them. There's a lot of pejorative names around them as well, but they are the transmission of wisdom. And when we tell our story, and particularly if we can find other people, and it can come through the arts, it can come through film, but if we find other places of resonance and we can kind of start to bring our story and weave it into the fabric of those that have come before us, we're now contributing to collective wisdom, which is in short supply these days. Okay.
Yep.
This whole idea of what do I do beyond the next 3 seconds is really hard for people. That's why we've got an anxiety kind of epidemic. And it often means to really settle into who I am, what my story is, and how it fits into the stories of those that love and support me. Here, those that are gone, those that live above, below, and so on.
So can you share a little bit, Mike, about who you help? And maybe if you, without getting into details about a person's name and everything, but just maybe an example of somebody that's kind of come to you for assistance and you've been able to kind of walk with them and what that looks like.
Yeah. So one of the things that, before the book, I never really advertised is that I had, deep personal trauma. I had an uncle who was killed tragically, and at his funeral, there was another tragedy. And that put me into, kind of a catastrophic grief and some PTSD, as did around the people around me and my family. And there was a long healing process. So that was something that, I held in shame, never told anybody. Got into therapy, still didn't tell, and it kind of meant that I had this open secret, like it's something that was on the internet, and yet I didn't tell anybody. So what's very strange, and, I don't advertise in some sense, is that people who had some kind of unthinkable thing happen, their version of it, seem to find me. Now, one of the problems we have in our society is that we think, okay, well, someone that has some terrible trauma is going to have a ruined life and, and not be functional in society. And we'll see them on the streets and heavily medicated and all these kinds of things. That's not at all the case. What we know is that over 70% of adults have had adverse childhood experiences. We know that, 60 to 80%, depending who you talk to, of adult people are dealing with some kind of, or have dealt with some kind of mental illness. I hesitate to use the word. To make a really long answer shorter here, the people that come to me seem to find me through resonance. And well, nowadays that I've got a book and I'm on podcasts, they are hearing more directly. It's like, oh, this is a guy who lived through the darkest days, and I've had the worst day of my life. I haven't told anybody. I'm functioning, unlike what people said about me. And sometimes I'm a CEO, or sometimes I'm an executive, or sometimes I'm an author or a cinematographer. I'm functioning, but you know what? I'm not always fine.
Yeah.
I could use a bit of help.
Interesting. One thing you just watching the news and just the amount of information that's available to us all the time. We're always on social media, everything. There's so much information coming to us, and we are living things in real time.
Yep.
In another city, another country. I just kind of, my mind, as you're speaking, my mind goes to just the horrific things that happen in like schools and stuff in the States.
Yep.
Here in Canada, we're kind of watching this from afar, but you're seeing people living out trauma in front of you. And sometimes it's live. And the impact on viewers, even from a distance, is substantial, I think, because it sits with you, and it's not like it's very, very real. And again, with the abundance of ways to get information nowadays, like I said, we can see this live as it happens, and it I don't think we can really shut it off, Mike.
Well, one of the things, I've talked about Cal Newport, and just before I touch the main part of this, is actually learning to shut some of these things off,
Okay.
actually managing our feeds. For a while there, I was kind of thinking, oh, social media is the devil and you got to turn it all off. And it's not realistic. What I've heard a couple other experts, and what I'm starting to learn is like, well, our social media is actually like a teenager. And we're going to have to really work on bringing it into adulthood. And in a sense, it means that each and every one of us is going to have to be responsible around what we're clicking on, so that we can train the algorithm
Good.
to feed us things that are actually going to nourish us, not scare the bejesus out of us.
Nice.
There
Okay.
is such thing as vicarious trauma, to go back to what you're saying. I've actually had people call me up and say, wow, like, I live in this city and there was a shooting and it was 10 miles away, and now I'm terrified for my family.
Yeah.
It always bothered me, but it was always something on TV. And now it's like, it could have been my family, my street, my neighbors.
Yeah.
So I think there's two very real things. There is, like this kind of thing that we call the real world, and then the virtual world. And we've got a lot of kind of bad things happening. So there is a demand to really step up. And for what you're talking about, like, this is deep feeling. There are lives being lost here.
Yeah.
People being impacted. And so that requires educating yourself in perhaps a different way than simply, the one that we're accustomed to through the school system. And it means going inside, locating your own feelings, locating it. I think, we talked previously about, hey, in theater, we know about how to hold a posture on stage so that a person in the audience knows what we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of us is walking around with a posture, a gait. We go into gestures, they're habitual. And that's got a lot to do with our feeling reality, and we're totally unconscious to it. It's just not conveyed in our society. But I think to get at these things that are really deep, really painful, really meaningful, we start to unpack some of that. And ideally, if we get through it, we start to walk around the world in a whole new way.
Yeah. When I think of just the term PTSD, I think of, someone serving in the military. I think of like a first responder, a doctor, nurse, maybe even a minister, those kind of people who deal with traumatic events in real time and the impact on them. And that quote unquote normal average people who have a daily 9-to-5 job and do whatever they do are less impacted. But as I'm listening and as I'm learning and gaining new information, it's not just regulated to people in high stress, traumatic careers that are impacted by this kind of trauma. So this whole PTSD is wider than I thought, and the age range is wider than I thought when I first started learning about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, there's huge studies, and they really started after Afghanistan, Iraq wars. Before those times, we had names for these things, but we would have said soldiers were shell shocked, or we'd know somebody in the community, maybe in our family, who just drank too much, but it's because he had a terrible case of the shakes. Well, that was PTSD, and I mean, eventually it'd be DTs and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But it was started because of the anxiety and the after effects of trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean, like, if we're in a high stress job, if we're an ambulance attendant, if we're physician, emergency room physician, for example, just because you see things, just because you interact with things, doesn't mean you're going to be traumatized by them.
Okay.
And quite often, these people that are highly trained, they've chosen the profession and they have a skill set that allows them to deal very effectively with what's in front of them at that place and time. Now, if you add in something like an addiction, or you add in something like too much stress in another domain that they're not coping with, then yeah, the odds of the PTSD start to change right around. The other piece that we know lots about is childhood makes a difference in who gets PTSD and who doesn't. And we kind of saw those in soldiers where, hey, a grenade was launched, I lost a leg, that person lost an arm, the person between us died. Now, one person got PTSD and the other doesn't.
Mm.
And when they started to say why, there's serious catastrophic loss here. How come there's PTSD in this case, and how come there's post-traumatic growth in the other case? And it all has to do with early childhood experience, what kind of bonding there was, what kind of attachment there was, and therefore, because of what the person has internalized around the world, no matter how bad it gets, there's always a way to carry on. It always gets better. If people have that message right into their cells, they tend to have horrible experience, but it's not PTSD.
Post-traumatic growth? I don't know if I've ever heard this before. Can you
seriously too? Sure.
Can you go a little bit deeper on that? I'm like, a little flag went up when you said that. I'm like, what was that? Well, I've never, seriously, I really do love, I'm curious. What can you explain more?
Well, and there's almost like a small industry in the coaching world where we're trying to reframe some of these things as no matter what happens in life, there is an opportunity coming from it. We can grow later. So the basic kind of fundamentals of human growth is we add a stress, but it's got to be an appropriate stress. So think about it in terms of weightlifting. If we lift the right amount of weights, we go home that night, we rest, our body's going to start rebuilding. Yeah. If we try and pick up the wrong weight, it's going to collapse on our chests and we've got to get help to get it off us. We're injured, right? So that would be too much stress. The analogy in terms of trauma here is that on the outside, there's a traumatic event, but for whatever reason, and it's a whole combination of reasons, the inside, the person who's there is able to meet it. Even if they collapse in the moment, they meet it and it stimulates growth mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. We see it all the time. It doesn't get as many headlines because, again, our society and with social media and with the news cycle that we currently live on, mainstream media, the negativity sells. Yeah. If we can hit the fear button, we're going to get more likes, we're going to get more views, we'll get more advertising dollars. So the post-traumatic growth story is one that's kind of living in the background, but there's authors, I can't think of one, but they're out there. It'll be a quick Google search, you'll find them, who are already publishing on this. It's almost like the best kept secret that everyone should know about. Because one of the things that, I don't like is that we've got all kinds of labels going around and they're circulating, especially on TikTok now, where people are self-diagnosing. And that then becomes the reason for not living my life. Well, I've got PTSD, therefore I no longer work, which it might be true at the beginning, you're not able. And then a depression can set in and then like some very serious stuff can happen. But if you're able to do the healing, there's absolutely no reason you can't go on and live a perfectly normal and, in fact, sometimes a wonderful, exceptional life. So the labels that we've got to drop them when they no longer serve us.
Yes, that makes total sense. Right, because otherwise you live under that cloud for the rest of your life and that becomes your ceiling. You can't grow past that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. So tell me more about what's in this book, Mike, that's going to help readers, and maybe a little bit about why you wrote this book.
I think, well, there's lots of things. I've had people, I've had the benefit of being out for a few months now, and people, write back to me and say, I love this part, or, the story you told about your daughter was just exceptional and made everything come together. Do you really tell stories with your daughter like that? And yes, my daughter loves stories. Yes, we tell stories together, you know. And it isn't a how-to book. Like it's not spelled in steps. This is along the lines of myth, story, fairy tale, and in a sense, there is a kind of a big piece of my personal journey, but it also is an indictment of the mental health system as we have it now. We're legislating out things like human connection, human contact, things that make us human. So, I call some attention to that, but really the emphasis is on, hey, here's a myth. Here's how I think, this myth has worked for me. And as you live your life, particularly if it takes some time and examine it, there's probably already a myth going on in you. When I was working as a therapist, I used to say to people, like, what was your favorite fairy tale growing up? Or did you have a favorite princess? Or who was your favorite superhero? And one of those questions would usually invoke a smile, a memory. Aren't you here to listen to my problems? Like, what's that got to do with anything?
Nice. Yeah.
And I, of course, would say, yeah, I know your problems are important, but I'm actually helping people live richer, deeper lives. And if you want to grow beyond your problems, sometimes it really helps to get that wild imagination of your childhood where anything was possible going again in adulthood.
Yeah. Because
Yes,
everything, yeah,
right. That's in the book.
everything around us squashes our imagination, and we live vicariously through everyone else on social media, for example, and we never develop ourselves. We just keep looking at all these other people and how their lives are all perfect and my life's terrible. They have all the fancy everything and I have nothing. And we just live our lives through there instead of, okay, well, put that away for a while. And how much time have you invested in yourself? How much time have you invested in growing and developing those things that you admire in others? Maybe if you spent more time on that, you could be the people that you admire.
Dave, I knew we'd get along so well again today.
See?
You're speaking for me.
Right? But like you just see it, like there's just people who complain. You're like, oh, that person has success and I have none. Yet you've not put an ounce of effort into being successful. I don't understand. They've worked, they've done more. You're seeing the results of their hard work. You haven't seen day one to day 365 to get there, but you just look at the results all the time. Can't be results oriented all the time. We have to be process, I think.
Yeah.
Focused.
And I think, inside those mindsets, we're often discounting our own starting place and our own trials. And then comparisons are, terrible for our mental health in so many ways. They're great for, athletics if we're looking about gold medals and so on, but they're not that good for our day to day. They almost set us up to be victims to our own kind of circumstance. And we do need to kind of get a kind of a proper calibration. Okay, this is the place I started, which isn't the same as where that other person started. And, this is kind of my talent pool. If we're, what I really love doing people is kind of like, okay, within that talent pool, where is this little piece of you that's absolutely a genius that could come out into the world if we set up circumstances right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have kind of a victim mindset for very good reason. Bad things have happened.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of say, hey, this is where you actually need to connect. This is the time to really kind of lean in, not quit and resign for the rest of your life. And, there's an old saying about, a man who's died in 1976 was buried in 1998. So he lived around like the Walking Dead for 20 years
Hmm.
because life had nothing else to offer him.
Hmm.
He'd lost and lost and lost until he just kind of quit. And I think that's the opposite, but it is, again, and particularly for men. I mean, you must know this. I don't know if you know this personally because you're kind of out there and engaged and kind of improving your life and so many other lives, but you must know people who, as men, we're kind of encultured to not ask for help. That's a weakness. Not feel our feelings. That's a
Hmm.
weakness.
So on top of this podcast we're talking about today, Living the Next Chapter, I also have a podcast called Dad Space. And I would love one dad to another dad,
Yeah.
if you could share a little bit of encouragement to dads right now. And what I want to do is repurpose this conversation over there because that's a different audience.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think what we're talking about right now is really applicable to dads as well. But from your dad experience, how does all this play into being a dad and being an example to your family?
I mean, bad things happen to everybody sooner or later. And one of the things, I've had a daughter who's going to camp this summer, and it's day camp, it's still just a little post COVID, who's now struggling in this kind of much bigger social sphere. Things are open, so there's a whole bunch of older kids there. She's playing, and she's gotten into trouble.
Hmm.
And so what I've learned from this is we actually had, a little kind of sit down. Her mom and I, we sat there and we waited. Now, she was actually terrified to tell me what she'd done because I was going to get mad at her.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, well, I might get mad, but I can assure you I'm not mad right now. And in fact, I'm concerned. Now, here's me. I mean, I'm Irish through and through, hot temper, 100%. So
Yeah.
she's witnessed me getting angry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But here's something serious. And when it was serious, I was able to sit down and say, we're going to connect here and we're going to support you and we're going to find a way to get you through this incident so that you can go back to camp tomorrow and not hit somebody else.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is totally uncharacteristic of her. But we had to find out what was going on inside of her world that she felt the need to escalate to this level. Right. So maybe I have, a very fortunate set of circumstances with, okay, this is the first incident where my daughter has done that. But I think the rule still applies. It's how do we actually connect? And I mean, for me, I'm separated from my spouse, so we're not living under the same roof,
Mm-hmm.
and getting over some hurdles to make sure that my child was getting what she needed in this circumstance. And I mean, 20 minutes later, she kind of told her mom what had happened, lots of tears, kind of mapped it out on a whiteboard. It was easier than saying the words, and then came back and then had, her mom tell me the story and sat on my lap. And I said, look, can you feel my body? Am I angry? And she said,
Interesting.
no. Can you feel that I love you and I've got my hand at your back? And she said, yes. I said, well, that's usually a dad's job.
Wow.
So I really had to step up in this circumstance.
I love how you've approached that. And at the very beginning of our chat today, you talked about touch
Yeah.
as part of the whole process. And you just illustrated that by mentioning this situation and how you handle this. Tell me before we wrap up in a few minutes, the power of touch, because I think, again, like post-traumatic growth is new, touch is new. There's so many new things I'm learning just talking to you, Mike. Talk about the power of touch in the process.
Yeah. So in terms of healing, there's a small but growing kind of research, mainly spearheaded by Tiffany Field down in Florida. And she's got the Touch Research Institute, and she's mainly working with massage therapists, but not exclusively, because she did all of her kind of actual research on premature babies, neonates. And just by touching them with, very, very simple protocols, she was able to show that babies that were touched gained weight more quickly and were out of the hospital more quickly and were able to live with their families more quickly. And we're talking like weeks sooner.
Mm-hmm.
So then she started to look at the moms, and then she started to look at moms with depression. Then she started to look at other people with depression. And each and every time, touch or some kind of touch intervention, whether it be massage or some of the other things, helped. So these are now physical body interventions that are helping psychological function. Okay? That's kind of mind-blowing in our literature. Anybody with a bit of common sense that had a grandmother or even a mom who would kiss their boo-boo and make it better would kind of know this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something like we forget by the time we're adults.
Wow. And in our world of social media, we're so disconnected on a personal level. Like, we can't speak to each other in public anymore. We can't interact as two human beings across a table with a cup of coffee because we're used to seeing everybody through our screens.
Yep.
And there's no way to reach out and touch somebody and be in that kind of intimate communication space. And then with our kids even, and with our spouse and our partners and our friends, that hand on the back you mentioned with your daughter.
Yeah.
You can't replicate that over a phone.
Absolutely not. I mean, there's wonderful things we can do with tone of voice and kind of pacing, and we can convey through our voice, how much we're smiling. People can do that. There's been studies, and how much we care.
Yeah.
But touch does something that these things can't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So people saying, "Oh yeah, but I think you're crazy. Like this doesn't matter." It's like, okay, sure. Can you survive as an adult without touch? Yes, absolutely. But are you also operating at a deficit, much like what happens if you're insomniac and you're operating at a sleep deficit?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, if you don't sleep at all, you die. But if you sleep too little, you're going to have all kinds of other issues. And they include health issues like elevated blood pressure, mood, all sorts of things. Touch is much the same way. It is an actual human need. Babies do die without it, and we've got studies going back to Romania and some places. Oh, forget the one, but there's Harlow's monkeys on monkeys. Like there are just cases where we know that without touch we die as infants. As
Mm-hmm.
adults, it just means we don't thrive.
Yeah. Well, and so that is part of your approach to mental health. And I guess one of the things that you feel important as far as working with people is getting past just the conversation, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. And, I mean, I've been over Zoom as well, so it's not like I'm the one doing any of this kind of stuff, but people have had someone say to me, it's like, look, I don't really like people. I don't want them touching me. Like, it's like, how do you get your touch? It's like, well, my dog. I was like, okay, perfect. That's actually better than most people, to be honest.
Yeah. I love that. That's great, Mike. I like that you open that up. Because there's some people who just know that's not their thing.
No.
But
if you own a dog and you've got that unconditional love in your life that only dogs can give, then great. And I mean, cats do it a different way. Like, I think there's all these kinds of things that do help and do matter. And is a big part of what I see is not just mental health, but mental wellness, whole human capacity, potential.
So, Mike, let's end on a positive note, because again, we talk about the news and how down it can be. Mental wellness, I think, needs to be spoken about just as much as mental illness, because we need to focus on what we can do to get better and how we can get to where we need to be. Remove that ceiling, that cloud, and let's push through and let's be better. So for those listening today, Mike, and they're struggling, really struggling, post-pandemic, everything. And they're just looking for some mental wellness, something to focus on. Where do we go? How do we find that spot that we focus our attention on?
I think one of the things you're going to find just about everywhere these days is mindfulness. It's a great place to start. If you are so inclined, something like yoga or Tai Chi.
Okay.
If you're still kind of, stuck in the house too often, you can even get these over Zoom, or, there's apps like Fit On and so on. You can do some of these things. Calm, and there's a whole bunch that do mindfulness. I'm always a proponent of find a person. I've got a strong bias that way.
Yeah.
I'm also a reader. I'm an author, and read probably more than I probably should. It takes up a lot of my time.
Yeah.
So I'm always going to say, hey, you know what? There's some fantastic books. It can be my book, it could be other books. Mine's all about story. If you're into things that are much more step by step, they're out there too.
Yeah.
And you know what? YouTube, TikTok, if you're in there for the forces of good, all the big players on mental wellness and human potential and growing, they're all on there. So instead of kind of maybe tuning into the news and the negativity, watch a video instead that's going to take you one step further, or allow you to be not so sad for the next 15 minutes. Like I've been in spots where I'm counting the time that way. It's like, all right, the whole day's terrible. Now I need to put a bright light at one point in it so that I can make an exception to the rule if my life sucks.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
And that helps. And that has a compounding effect.
Amazing. So while we're chatting here, Mike, I have your website up in front of me. I've been scrolling through and clicking on stuff as we're talking. So let's send people to the website, Mike, so they can connect with you. Yeah. That'd be great. What's the address?
It's michaelhynes.ca. So michaelhynes.ca. I'm also on LinkedIn. That's where I'm the most active. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. You won't see a lot of posts out of me there, but I'm there.
Yep.
And the book's on Amazon.
Let's see the book again, Mike. Come on.
Hey,
you gotta see it. There it is. The Myth Guided Mind right there, everyone. So those who are watching on YouTube, definitely the links are always in the show notes. Please go and support Mike. And Mike, what a great conversation today. Post-traumatic growth. It's my new thing. I love it. I'm going to think about this a lot.
Awesome, Dave. It was such a pleasure talking to you again.
Excellent. Everyone, please go support Mike. Check out his information. Let him know you heard about him. Go on the podcast. And for those listening on Dad Space, this is Mike, guys. He's great. It's a dad. He's right here. So awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Excellent. Thanks for listening to Dad Space today. Go check us out on all of our social media, YouTube, all that great stuff. You can find us as Dad Space Podcast. Real simple. Dad Space Podcast, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, even YouTube. Email us, dadspacepodcast@gmail.com. We're always looking for great guests to come on the podcast. If you have any feedback for us, let us know here at Dad Space. Looking forward to connecting with you on the next episode, right here of Dad Space. Follow us on your podcast app for more. Cheers. To you, Dad.